Jake had heard all the rumors. His new apartment, tucked in the heart of the city, was old, too old. A place with cracked walls, creaky floors, and a history that didn't quite sit right. But as a college student, he was more concerned with rent than ghost stories. When he moved in with his roommate Samantha, she warned him. "You've heard the rumors, right?" she'd asked, her voice low and cautious. Yeah, Jake had laughed it off. Old building, probably got a few weird stories. It's fine. It was an easy dismissal, until the sound began. At first, it was nothing. A soft shuffle, faint as a whisper, that Jake assumed was the old pipes or maybe the neighbors. But as the days wore on, it grew. Footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing just outside their door. Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but he never spoke about it. He didn't believe in this stuff. He was a skeptic. That first night, it was a little late, maybe around 2 in the morning. Jake was lying in bed, eyes closed, trying to ignore the faint sound. Then it stopped, suddenly, and that was when it started again. The footsteps, step, 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 slow and heavy, walking toward their door. Jake shot up from his bed, his heartbeat pounding in his chest. He glanced at the door. No one was there. Probably just Samantha, he thought, pushing the fear away. But deep down, something nagged at him. And so he brushed it off, until the next night. The days passed, and the footsteps continued. Every night, slow, deliberate steps that seemed to crawl through the silence of the apartment building. Jake tried to pretend he wasn't bothered. He was a rational person, right? He had to be. But tonight, Samantha was out, visiting friends from her other classes, and Jake was left alone in the apartment. The usual dread crept in, but Jake wasn't the kind of guy to run from his fears. He was going to prove it was just his imagination. At midnight, he stood in front of the apartment door, staring at the peephole, waiting. It was a game now. How long before the sound started again? And then it came. Step, step, step. It was a slow rhythm that seemed to echo through the halls. Jake's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. He cracked the door open just slightly, peeking out into the dim hallway. Nothing. He checked the corners, the shadows, empty. Just old wood. He muttered to himself, creaky floors. Nothing. But something caught his eye. Out of the corner of his vision, he saw it. A shadow darting into one of the dark corners of the hallway. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He could have sworn it wasn't there before. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on the spot. His skin tingled, the hairs on his arms standing on end. He stepped back, closing the door gently, but the sensation of being watched didn't leave. He spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at the shadows, waiting for something to move. And then, just as dawn began to break, it came. The shadow. It appeared in the hallway, dark and elongated, gliding silently towards him. Its shape was distorted, almost unnatural, its edges blurred, like a figure out of a nightmare. Before Jake could even react, the shadow vanished, but the icy chill that followed remained, a reminder of the thing he'd seen. The next night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in. The footsteps had stopped, but the dread hadn't. He felt it in his bones. It was then that he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of slow, deliberate footsteps. Step, step, step. Jake's breath caught. His pulse quickened. He sat up, gripping the edge of his bed. This time, he wasn't going to ignore it. He stood, heart racing, and made his way to the door. His hand trembled as he reached for the knob. He opened the door slowly, peering out into the dark hallway. Nothing. But then the air shifted. The temperature dropped in an instant, and the hallway seemed to stretch further into darkness. And then it happened. The figure emerged from the shadows. It was her, the woman. Her form was distorted, darker than the shadows themselves, with hollow eyes that stared straight through Jake. She was standing directly in front of his door. Jake froze, his entire body locked in place. Her hand reached out, long and skeletal, toward him. The air around him turned frigid as her presence closed in. Jake's stomach dropped as he felt a sudden icy grip on his arm. Her cold fingers dug into his skin, pulling him into the hallway. His heart raced. He tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong. His vision blurred with panic, and all he could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. Jake snapped back to reality, his survival instincts kicking in. He jerked away from the woman's grasp, stumbling backward into his apartment. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. The temperature in the room dropped instantly, but the shadow, whatever it was, didn't follow. He stood there, gasping for breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. His heart was pounding, his limbs shaking uncontrollably. The next morning, Jake packed his things. He tried to call Samantha, but there was no answer. It was like she had vanished. Samantha had been gone for days, but Jake couldn't bring himself to leave until now. He was done with the apartment, done with whatever haunted it. As Jake grabbed his final bag, he paused at the door, one last glance at the hallway that had tormented him. The footsteps were gone, but the eerie silence remained. He stepped outside, his mind racing. As the door clicked shut behind him, Jake realized something terrifying. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow and deliberate, waiting for him. Jake broke into a run, but the sound followed him, louder with each step. It was only then that he realized he hadn't escaped at all. David had been on the road for hours, the endless stretch of highway winding through desolate fields and forests. It was late, far past midnight, and he was driving alone, a young man on a solo road trip. The only thing keeping him company was the radio until the static started. A burst of white noise filled the car, followed by an eerie silence. David fiddled with the dial, trying to get a signal, but nothing came through except the faint crackle of static. Frustrated, he leaned back in his seat, glancing out the window at the empty stretch of road. There wasn't a single car in sight, not for miles. Just the road, the trees, and the endless night. Then he saw her, a figure by the side of the road, a young woman standing with her thumb out, looking as though she had been waiting for hours. Her hair was dark, and her clothes looked worn, as if she had been walking for a long time. David hesitated. He didn't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about her, her tired eyes, made him feel sorry for her. After a moment of indecision, he pulled over, the tires of his car crunching on the gravel as he stopped. The woman stepped forward, her face shadowed in the dim light from the car's headlights. "Need a ride?" David asked, his voice softer than he intended. She nodded, her face unreadable. The woman opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, the car rocking slightly as she settled in. "Thanks," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "I'm Sarah." David gave her a brief nod. "Where are you headed?" "Just to the next town," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down, and I hadn't seen anyone for ages." David glanced at her briefly, trying to gauge her. She didn't seem upset or particularly worried, just calm and distant. "No problem," David said, trying to make light of the situation. "The next town's not far, we'll get you there." The road stretched on, dark and empty, the headlights cutting through the thick night air, but something felt off. The longer they drove, the heavier the silence became. The car's headlights flickered for a split second, then returned to normal. The air inside the car felt colder, and David couldn't shake the sense but something was wrong. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Sarah staring out the window, her face pale, her eyes distant, as though she was looking at something far off. Her gaze was fixed, and her lips were tight, pressed into a thin line. "Are you all right?" David asked, glancing over at her. She didn't respond, not immediately. When she did, her voice was barely a whisper. "Do you feel it? Something's watching us." David shivered, her words sending an uncomfortable chill down his spine. He turned onto a narrow back road, hoping to break the tension. As the tires hummed over the pavement, David glanced to his side. The seat was empty. David slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt as his heart raced. He whipped his head around to check the passenger seat, but there was no sign of Sarah. The door was locked, and yet she was gone. Panic gripped him, his chest tightening as the temperature in the car plummeted. The air felt thick, suffocating, like he was driving through a fog of ice. He opened the door and stepped out, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Sarah," he called, his voice trembling. "Where are you?" The road was deserted, not a single soul in sight. He felt a knot form in his stomach, the eerie quiet pressing against his ears. Then something caught his eye. Off in the distance, by the side of the road, Sarah was standing there again, her back to him. David's heart raced as he quickly climbed back into the car. He slammed the door shut and revved the engine, the car lurching forward. But no matter how fast he drove, the road never seemed to end. The trees blurred past, the lines on the road twisted and stretched, making it feel as if he was driving in circles. And then she appeared again. This time, Sarah's face was different. Her features were twisted, grotesque, her eyes hollow, and her skin deathly pale. She stood by the side of the road, staring at him with a look of pure despair. David's breath hitched in his throat, and he swerved, barely missing her. The car lurched, and suddenly everything went dark. He slammed his fists against the steering wheel, the car jerking forward as the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, casting long shadows across the road. The car came to a sudden stop, and the world was completely silent. David opened the door, stepping out again. The road was empty. Sarah was gone. David drove for what felt like hours, his mind reeling, the exhaustion and fear taking their toll. His hands were trembling as he finally reached a small town, a cluster of dimly lit buildings on the horizon. He parked the car and stumbled into the nearest gas station. An old man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper as David walked in, pale and sweating. "Is everything all right, son?" the old man asked, eyeing David with a curious, knowing look. David nodded, his voice shaking. I saw something on the road. A woman. She disappeared. She was gone, then reappeared, her face. The old man didn't seem surprised. He put down his newspaper and nodded gravely. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "People see her all the time. She died on that stretch of road years ago. If you ever see her again, don't stop. If you do, you'll never leave." David felt a chill crawl up his spine. He tried to laugh it off, but the old man's words stayed with him as he left the gas station and drove out of the town. The road ahead seemed endless, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape the memory of Sarah's hollow eyes, staring at him from the side of the road. Sarah and Jacob had been looking for a quiet weekend getaway, away from the bustle of the city. After weeks of planning, they finally found what seemed like the perfect spot, a cabin for rent deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The listing promised peace and solitude, ideal for their getaway. The price was surprisingly low, and the photos showed a cozy, rustic cabin nestled in the heart of the forest. When they arrived, however, the air felt different. There was an eerie silence that hung over the place, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. No sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches creating long shadows that seemed to stretch out forever. Jacob, ever the adventurer, was undeterred. "It's perfect," he said, smiling as he pulled the car up to the small cabin. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She glanced around, feeling the weight of the silence pressing against her. The cabin itself looked older than in the pictures. The once white paint was faded and peeling, the porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. Inside, there was a strange smell, like something decayed and forgotten. The floorboards creaked as Sarah stepped inside, and an uneasy chill swept over her. "Just give it a chance," Jacob said, his voice light and reassuring as he placed his hand on her shoulder. But even as he spoke, Sarah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that they were not alone. The first night in the cabin was relatively calm, but Sarah couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside set her on edge. She stared at the ceiling, waiting for the sounds of the night to settle, but they never did. Jacob slept soundly, oblivious to her unease, his breathing steady and peaceful. Sarah tried to push the feelings aside, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the night wore on, things began to feel off. The house felt colder, as though the warmth of the day had been sucked out by the woods themselves. And then she heard it, the faintest whisper, like a voice in the distance. She froze, heart pounding, straining to listen. Nothing, just the wind. But then there it was again, a soft whisper, too distant to make out, but too real to ignore. The next night, things took a darker turn. Jacob woke up to scratching sounds coming from outside their window. The noise was sharp, relentless, like something, or someone, was scraping its nails against the glass. "What the hell is that?" Jacob muttered, sitting up and reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. Sarah's heart raced, her eyes wide with fear. "Probably just the wind," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But even as she spoke, she knew something wasn't right. Jacob shined the light out the window, but there was nothing there. No animals, no wind-blown branches, nothing. Still, the scratching continued, faint at first, but growing louder, as if whatever it was had come closer. He turned to Sarah, trying to calm her. "It's fine, probably just an animal. Go back to sleep." But Sarah couldn't. She felt like she was being watched, like invisible eyes were following her every move. As the hours passed, the temperature in the cabin dropped. Cold air began to seep through the cracks in the walls, making her shiver despite the blankets she pulled around herself. Shadows seemed to dance across the walls, twisting and shifting in the dim light. "I think we should leave tomorrow," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jacob looked at her, surprised. "What?" "Come on, it's just a couple of strange noises. It's probably an old cabin thing." But Sarah was already on edge. The whispers from earlier hadn't stopped. Now they were louder and more distinct, like voices, low and murmuring just beyond her hearing. By the third night, Sarah's anxiety had reached a breaking point. She was too scared to sleep, too scared to even close her eyes for a moment. Jacob, exhausted from their days of hiking and exploring the woods, had finally drifted into a restless sleep beside her. Then it started again, the loud bangs on the walls. It sounded like someone was pounding on the outside of the cabin, relentless, as though trying to break through. Jacob sat up suddenly, his eyes wide with alarm. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, reaching for his flashlight. Before he could react, the door to their bedroom creaked open, slow and steady. A tall, dark figure peered in the doorway. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat as she froze, unable to speak. The figure stood there, unmoving. It had no clear features, just a vague silhouette, but its hollow eyes gleamed in the darkness. Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came from her lips. Jacob, too, was frozen, his body stiff with fear. He finally found his voice, his words shaky. "Who's there? What do you want?" But the figure did not answer. It only watched them, its presence suffocating, like the air around them had thickened. A cold, unnatural chill filled the room, and Sarah could feel it. A coldness that wasn't just from the temperature, but from something much darker, much older. Suddenly, Jacob sprang from the bed, but before he could reach the figure, the air around them thickened, pressing in on him. His breath came out in quick gasps, and his heart pounded as he turned to Sarah. "We have to leave." "No." He reached for the door, but just as he touched the handle, Sarah screamed, a piercing, terrified cry, as a cold hand settled on her shoulder. Jacob spun around, but the figure was gone. The room was now completely silent, the weight of its presence lingering in the air like a suffocating fog. The whispers, now louder than ever, filled Sarah's mind, growing frantic and desperate. They sounded like voices, screaming for help, pleading for release. The house groaned and creaked as if it were alive and in pain. Jacob grabbed Sarah's hand, his grip tight. "We need to go." "No." But as they turned to flee, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The walls shook, the house trembling, as if it were on the verge of collapse. In a desperate frenzy, Sarah and Jacob scrambled to find another way out. The windows wouldn't open, the doors were locked, and the house seemed to close in on them with every passing second. Frantic, they ran through the house, but no matter which direction they took, the same path led them back to the same room. They were trapped. The whispers were deafening now, echoing inside their heads, pushing them to the brink of madness. Finally, with no other option, they fled into the woods, running blindly through the trees, their feet stumbling over roots and branches. The whispers followed them, persistent and maddening, urging them forward. The trees seemed to reach out with twisted limbs, grabbing at their clothes, pulling them back into the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled out onto a road, gasping for breath. But when they turned to look back, the cabin was gone. There was nothing but an empty stretch of forest, silent and still. They never spoke of the events that had unfolded that night, but both knew neither of them would ever return to those woods. Some nights, Sarah still hears the whispers, as if they're calling to her, beckoning her to return. Anna had just moved into the quiet suburban neighborhood, eager for a fresh start after a turbulent year. The house was perfect for her, a charming little cottage with large windows that overlooked the peaceful streets. It was exactly what she needed, a place to breathe, to reset, and to feel at home. The first few nights were peaceful. She enjoyed the calm of the area, the chirping of crickets, and the quiet lull of the neighborhood. But after a few days, something strange began to happen. Every time Anna looked out her window at night, she saw it. Across the street, in the window of the house opposite hers, there was a dark figure. It stood completely still, facing her, motionless, like a shadow cast in the shape of a man. At first, she thought it was her imagination, maybe the reflection of a tree or a passing car's headlights, but no matter what time of night it was, the figure was always there. At first, it was just unsettling, but as the days went by, the unease began to grow. The figure never moved. It never blinked or turned away, just stood there, staring into the darkness, watching Anna. She felt a creeping sense of discomfort, like something was lurking just out of sight. It wasn't her imagination. There was someone, or something, watching her. The nights grew longer, and Anna's discomfort deepened. Every evening, she found herself instinctively drawn to the window, half expecting the figure to be there. And every night it was, standing in the same spot in that empty house, motionless, never moving. She tried to ignore it at first, telling herself it was just an optical illusion, or perhaps a trick of the light. But that theory didn't hold for long. The figure was always there, never changing, always watching. She started to feel paranoid. like the figure was aware of her movements, even when she was inside. Sometimes she would move around her house, and she would get the distinct feeling that it was still watching her, even though she couldn't see it. She would stop what she was doing, turn, and look toward the window, but there was nothing, just the same emptiness. Then came the tapping, soft at first, a delicate sound against the glass of her windows. It wasn't loud, just a gentle rapping, like someone lightly tapping with their fingers. But there was never anyone there when she checked. The tapping continued, every night, getting louder, more insistent. Anna's mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. Was someone playing a cruel prank on her? Could the figure be real, or was she losing her grip on reality? Sleep became elusive. Every night, her dreams were filled with the same disturbing image. The figure, closer now, standing just beyond her window, its face hidden in shadow. Every time she woke up, her heart raced, and she found herself looking out her window just to confirm it was still there. Finally, one evening, her growing fear reached a breaking point. She couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know. Anna mustered the courage to confront the figure. She grabbed her coat and walked across the street, her pulse racing as she approached the house where the figure always stood. The house was eerily silent, its windows dark. When she knocked on the door, her heart thudded loudly in her chest. An elderly woman answered, looking puzzled as Anna asked about the figure she had seen. The woman's brow furrowed in confusion. That house. No one lives there, the woman said, her voice soft but firm. It's been abandoned for years. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. But I've seen someone in the window, every night. The woman sighed, shaking her head. You're not the first to ask about that house. The previous owner, he disappeared mysteriously. No one ever figured out what happened to him. Anna's throat tightened as the woman's words sank in. Her gaze drifted toward the dark house. But just as she turned to leave, she heard it. A soft, whispering voice just behind her, faint but clear. Don't look back. But it was too late. As Anna turned around, the figure was there, standing just behind her, inches away. Its face was no longer hidden in shadow. It was twisted, grotesque, with an awful wide grin that stretched impossibly across its face. Anna didn't hesitate. She ran, stumbling back across the street and slamming the door behind her. She locked the windows and doors, breathing heavily, but the fear wouldn't leave her. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more persistent. The figure was back, standing motionless in the window, but now it was smiling, its grin impossibly wide, its eyes dark and hollow. The next morning, the house across the street was empty. No figure in the window, no tapping, just silence. But Anna knew better. Every time she glanced out her window, she could feel its presence, watching, waiting. And sometimes, just as she turned away, she swore she saw the figure standing there again, watching her from the darkness.